My name is Kristin Bird. I am the Executive Director of Burning Hearts Disciples, which is a nonprofit ministry apostolate in the diocese that serves to try to help parishes and the diocese and people really live out the new evangelization. So I used to work for about 15 years. I did youth ministry, high school and middle school religious ed and confirmation in Oshkosh, and then felt called out of that to really start working with adults more. I became a parent myself. That was a big motivation for that. I started to realize as a parent I did not know what I did not know. I didn't know how to pass on this faith to my own children. And so that's really what kind of prompted me to start moving in this direction of a new ministry. So why do we talk about story? Well, story has a really important place in our understanding of how things are passed on. Today, particularly in the world that we live right now, story is incredibly important. It was also important in the ancient world when they didn't have any written communication. But today we're kind of finding ourselves in a similar place. Not that we don't have written communication now, but that everything we do and take in, particularly in first world United States, is very small snippets, 140 character tweets, 30-second sound bites. We don't often have the patience as a culture anymore to really sit and listen to an entire story. And even when we do, it's often a visual story, movies, TV shows, things like that. So I want to talk to you about why we need to use story and know story and understand stories. There's a couple statistics up here for you that talk about, 2/3 of people in the world receive most of their communication orally. So if we're just writing news articles or blog posts or whatever it is that we're doing about our faith, we're going to miss 2/3 of the people in the world for whom they don't ever receive that way. They don't read. They don't have access to those materials. That's a third of people is their only source of information. That's more than 2 billion people in the world. 95% of women in the Islamic world can only be reached through oral communication. And my favorite, 75% of the Bible consists of stories. 75%. Jesus is asked 186 questions in the Gospels. He answers 3 of them directly. Most of the time, he either answers with another question or by telling a story. It was really shocking to me when I started kind of uncovering some of this and learning more about it. I realized a lot of the things that I know, a lot of the stories I know from the Gospels that I've heard so many times are not people that maybe actually existed, but are people Jesus is telling a story about. So for example, the Good Samaritan. He's not talking about a Samaritan that actually ran into this guy who was beaten on the road. He starts by saying, well, let me tell you a story. Once there was a man. He starts so many of his things with once upon a time, essentially. The same with the story of the prodigal son. Once there was a family. Once there was a son. So it's all these things that I didn't even realize until I was encountering them again, is Jesus telling stories about people. So to kick us off, I want to also start with a story. This is a Yiddish folk tale that I think applies greatly to what we're talking about today. Once upon a time, Truth went about the streets as naked as the day he was born. As a result, no one would let him into their homes. Whenever people caught sight of him, they turned away and fled. One day, when Truth was wandering sadly, he came upon Story. Now Story was dressed in splendid clothes of beautiful colors. And Story, seeing Truth, said, "Tell me, neighbor, what makes you look so sad?" Truth replied bitterly, "Brother, things are bad, very bad. I'm old, very old, and no one wants to acknowledge me. No one wants anything to do with me." Hearing that, Story said, "People don't run from you because you are old. I too am old, very old. But the older I get, the better people like me. I'll tell you a secret. Everyone likes things disguised and prettied up a bit. Let me lend you some splendid clothes like mine, and you'll see that the very people who pushed you aside will invite you into their homes and be glad of your company." Truth took Story's advice and put on the borrowed clothes. And from that time on, Truth and Story have gone hand in hand together, and everyone loves them. They make a happy pair. We start with life experience when we tell stories or when we listen to stories, and we allow people to pull truths out of them. We can disguise, pretty up a little bit, truth in the context of story to make it easier to receive, easier to understand. Have you seen, any of you seen at least one of these movies that I have up on the screen here? Yeah, okay. These are examples of stories that speak a truth. I want to use the example of Inside Out for just a moment because I have 3 young kids. I have Vinny is 11, Elizabeth is 9, and Isaac, my youngest, will be 7 tomorrow. He is very excited about that. Isaac, my youngest, has always been very emotional. We always joke he's either super happy or super angry, and he doesn't have a lot of middle ground in between. So one time when he was about 4 years old, 5 years old, he was having a massive tantrum, just losing his mind. And I was trying to figure out, how do I reach through all this emotion he's feeling right now and connect with him and talk with him and help him to get out of this place. And then we went and saw the movie Inside Out. And it was like, here it is. So the next time after we saw this movie that he got all worked up, he gets very easily frustrated when he can't do something. And he just started yelling. And I said to him, buddy, listen, do you remember the little red guy from Inside Out? I said, he's the one in control of your panel right now. I want to be able to talk to you about this. I want to be able to help you with this, but I need somebody else to be in control. Somebody else. So when somebody else is in control, we will come back to this and I will help you. We'll work through this issue. But until then, that's not what this isn't going to happen. Because the little red guy, you can see him up there on the screen if you haven't seen the movie, is voiced by Louis Black, those of you who are familiar with the comedian Louis Black. And all he does is literally hop and blow his lid and flames shoot out the top of his head because he's angry. And he can't function in any other capacity other than hopping mad and literally blowing his top when things happen. Now, that was a place in which my 5-6-year-old son was able to grasp a truth because he had seen it in a story. It put an image, a visual around it for him to be able to say, okay, so now when he gets mad, because he still does, right? He still gets angry and frustrated. He will say things to me like, Mom, I need to help the red guy get out of the way. And that's a cue for me. Okay, now I know what's happening. He feels it coming. You feel it when you're getting angry. And he feels it coming and he's like, I know what's going to happen. I need to get him out of the way for a minute. Or I need to find another way for him to blow his lid so I don't sock my sister, which is what happens occasionally. We need to find another place for him to blow that doesn't hurt someone. So for children, we know this. They love stories. In fact, child and adolescent development theory, I was an education major for a long time and taught 7th grade language arts before I got into youth ministry. And I learned a lot about child development theory. And one of the things we discover is that one of the ways we define how a child grows is how they interact with story. At the very basic level, they can receive story. They move to the next kind of level of development, and they're able to tell story. They move to the next level of development, and now they are able to take a step back and see their story or a story for its whole, in the whole way, and be able to pull meaning out of it. A lot of people have never taken the time to step back and reflect on their own faith. Why are you doing the things you're doing? Why do you go to Mass? Why do you pray the rosary? Why do you send your kids to religious ed? Why are you coming to confession? Whatever it is that people are doing, to take a step back and reflect on why. Story allows people to do that. It provides them a vehicle for being able to kind of step back a little bit and reflect. At the same time, if they're not ready for that, they can still enter into a story. They can maybe tell a story. So it really has broad-reaching application, regardless of where someone is on their faith journey and where they are in their development, from the very young to the very old. We never, ever outgrow our love and our need for stories. This is why we love movies, especially good movies or TV shows. I have a problem with Netflix. I feel like there should be a group like they have for, gambling and alcohol. Like, really, I have a problem with Netflix. Have you ever watched so many Netflix shows in a row that it pops up and it says, "Are you still watching?" I always feel like I'm being judged by, yes, I am, Netflix. I'm still watching. I'm fine with it. And why? Because I love the stories of those shows. And when it's a TV show, you got to watch the whole season to get the whole story. So then I end up watching it for way too long. So why do we use storytelling when we're trying to help people become disciples? What's the point of it? Well, not only do people love stories, which we've talked about, they highlight personal experience, which is a place we are culturally, but story is able to sidestep debate. Again, especially in the cultural time that we live in right now and our understanding and the value we place on personal experience. It's really hard to argue with someone who says, "Let me tell you about what happened to me." Because the only way you can argue with them is by calling them a liar and saying that never happened to you. We don't do that. So to tell a story is often a lot better way to break down barriers with people between our truths that we're trying to get across or that we understand to know and our life experience. They'll argue with apologetics, they'll argue with theology, they will argue with ideas, but it's very hard, and we often don't argue with stories. So story is able to sidestep debate. And then stories provoke interest. Madeleine L'Engle wrote A Wrinkle in Time, for those of you who are familiar with that book. And she was not a Christian when she said this quote, which was, "Jesus was not a theologian, he was a God who told stories." At the end of the Gospel of Luke is the story of the women who go to the tomb and discover the resurrection. Those women come to the tomb, they discover Jesus is risen. And what do? They run back to the disciples to tell them what? What they've seen, what they've experienced. If those women had run back to the disciples and said, "Let us now open for you all of the prophecies in the Old Testament and show you how you guys totally missed who this Jesus was," that would not have been effective. That wouldn't have sent the disciples running to the tomb to see what happened. If they had shown up and said, "Guess what we know? Yeah, we can't really tell you, but let's just tell you we have some truth here, and we're going to theologically now explain to you the resurrection and the crucifixion," and no. They didn't argue. They didn't debate. They didn't teach. They went and they told their story. And their story was so compelling, it sent the disciples then running to the tomb to see for themselves. The same thing happens with the woman at the well. Jesus encounters this woman at the well, and he tells her her story of her life. And she goes back to her town and is so moved by this encounter that she's had with him that she goes back and she says, what? "Hey, we have totally misunderstood the Messiah. We should all go to Jerusalem because our Samaritan ideas are totally wrong." No, she goes back and says, "Come and meet this man who told me things about me, who knew everything about me." She goes back and she tells her town her story. And they then are impelled to come out and meet him as well. Jesus never uses scripture as a starting point unless he is in a synagogue in the Gospels. The only time he starts by quoting scripture is when he's in a synagogue. When he's out on the street, when he's with people, when he's in relationships, he starts with stories. We call them the parables. He starts with stories. So we can look to his example to understand, how does this work? What does it do if we use stories? Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium has this quote that is really the core of our ministry and our apostolate. It says, "The church will have to initiate everyone, priests, religious, and laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other." Which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. Art of accompaniment is how we evangelize in the context of relationships, walking alongside people. That's how disciples are made. Programs do not make disciples. Email threads do not make disciples. The greatest process in the world does not make disciples. Disciples make disciples in relationship with one another. It's what Jesus did. He had 12. He walked with those 12. He entered into their life, and he allowed them to enter into his. And that he told them stories, and he walked with them. And even he didn't have a 100% success rate. Right? He lost one along the way. So if we can understand that this art of accompaniment, this walking with people, the person who comes in front of us in that moment, to acknowledge them as sacred ground, to acknowledge that they have a story of how they got to be where they are today, of how God has worked and moved in their life, even if they can't articulate it yet, they have a story. And if we acknowledge that, it allows for this conversion that is what I like to call a collision of narratives. It's where the story of our faith collides with the story of a person's life and our own story. And now suddenly people are finding things they have in common with each other in their stories, or they're saying, I'm missing something. That story was really compelling to me. Why don't I have that piece in my story? And it prompts them to ask those additional questions. So story is a way that we can live out this art of accompaniment. It can't be hurried. It requires an investment of time and energy. There's a reason why Jesus had 12, that he was able to really walk with and really disciple and have that relationship with, because it takes a significant investment of who we are. It requires vulnerability and being willing to hear someone's story and share our own story with them to be able to really walk that way. It's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. The most important story we have is our story, next to the gospel story. The most important story we have is our personal story, because that is where our faith has become real to us. And a lot of us have never taken time to sit down and think about, what is my story of faith? What is my story of encounter with God? What is my story of entering into relationship with the person of Jesus? It can be a hard thing to sit back and do. It can be hard sometimes to step out and reflect on, what is my full story? What's the big picture?